"You'll never own anything like your sister," my daughter-in-law Ashley said, lifting her wine glass with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and the table went quiet for half a second before someone chuckled, then another, until the sound filled the room like it belonged there, like it was normal, and my son Daniel didn't stop it, didn't even look at me. He just kept cutting his steak, as if those words hadn't just drawn a line through everything I had ever been to him, and I sat there, with my hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of every year I had spent building a life for that boy, every dollar saved, every sacrifice made, and I realized something in that moment, something cold and clear. I wasn't part of this family anymore, not in the way I thought I was, so I smiled, the same polite smile I'd worn at church socials and neighborhood potlucks for decades, and I nodded like I agreed with her, like I accepted the version of me they had already decided on, because arguing would have only made me smaller in their eyes, and I refused to shrink any further. The dining room lights felt too bright, the laughter too loud. The house I had once helped make a home now felt like a place I was just visiting, and when dinner ended, I didn't linger. I didn't offer to help with dishes the way I always did. I simply stood, picked up my coat, and walked out without saying goodbye. The night air was cooler than I expected, sharp against my skin, and I took a slow breath. As I reached my car, steadying myself, because what they saw when they looked at me was a woman who had been left behind, a widow living on memories, someone dependent, someone easy to dismiss, and for a long time, I had let them believe that. It was simpler that way, quieter, but as I sat behind the wheel, staring at my reflection in the dark windshield, I realized their mistake wasn't what they said at that table. It was what they never bothered to ask, because if they had, they might have seen the pieces I had been putting together in silence, the decisions I had made without their approval, the life I had been rebuilding one careful step at a time, and I started the engine with steady hands, not rushing, not angry, just certain, because the truth was, I didn't need a house like my sister's, I never did, and soon, they were going to understand exactly why I drove home that night along the same quiet streets I had known for over 30 years, past the grocery store where I used to shop with coupons clipped neatly in my purse, past the park where Daniel learned to ride his bike while I ran behind him with my hands outstretched, ready to catch him if he fell, and I realized how strange it felt that all those memories still lived in me while I had slowly disappeared from theirs. The house I pulled into was small, modest, the kind of place people assume holds nothing but routine and limitations, but inside, everything was exactly where I wanted it to be, clean, organized, intentional. I set my keys down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment in the quiet, no laughter, no sharp voices, no one watching me as if I were something to be measured and found lacking, just silence, the kind that does not weigh on your chest but steadies you. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table, the same table where I had spent months going over numbers, plans, documents, making decisions that no one in my family had ever asked about because they assumed there was nothing worth asking. They thought my life had narrowed after my husband passed, that it had shrunk into something small and predictable, but in truth, it had only become quieter, more focused. I reached for the folder I kept tucked neatly in the drawer beside me, the edges worn from use. Inside were papers that told a story no one had bothered to hear, statements, contracts, investments I had made slowly over the past 5 years, careful choices, each one building on the last, not flashy, not loud, just steady, the way I had always lived. I remembered the first time I sat down with Mr. Howard Green, how he looked at me over his glasses and asked if I was sure, if I understood the risks, and I had smiled then too, the same way I smiled at that dinner table tonight, calm, certain, because for the first time in a long time, I was not making decisions for anyone else, not for my husband, not for my son, not to keep peace or avoid conflict, but for myself. I flipped through the pages slowly, not because I needed to check anything, but because it grounded me, reminded me that what I had built was real, not something anyone could laugh away over dinner. Outside, a car passed, its headlights briefly washing across my window, and I thought about Ashley's voice, the way she said those words with such confidence, as if she had already decided what my future looked like, as if I had no say in it, and I realized that confidence had come from years of watching me stay quiet, watching me give in, watching me choose harmony over truth. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, and that was something I could not correct with arguments or explanations. Only with time, with actions they could not ignore. I closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer, my reflection faintly visible in the darkened window above the sink. I looked older than I used to. Of course I did. But there was something else there too. Something steadier. Something they had not seen yet. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the darkness settle around me, because I knew that what came next would not be loud or dramatic. There would be no confrontation, no raised voices, just a quiet shift. The kind that only becomes visible when it is already too late to undo. And for the first time that evening, I felt something close to peace. I woke up the next morning before sunrise, not because I had somewhere urgent to be, but because my mind had already moved ahead of me, clear and steady in a way it had not felt in years. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock above the stove, and for a moment I simply stood there in the kitchen, letting the stillness settle into me, because this was the space where everything had started to change, where I had sat night after night making decisions that no one else knew about. I brewed a pot of coffee the way I always had, measuring carefully, waiting for the slow drip to fill the glass carafe, and I realized how many things in my life had remained consistent even as the people around me had slowly shifted away. I carried my mug to the small desk by the window and opened my laptop, the screen lighting up the room with a pale glow. Emails waited for me, confirmations, updates, quiet acknowledgments of choices I had already set into motion. There was one message from Mr. Howard Green, time-stamped late the previous evening. I clicked it open and read it once, then again, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it settle fully into place. Everything was finalized, every document reviewed, every transfer completed, nothing left uncertain or exposed. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the empty street, a neighbor's car pulling out of their driveway, a dog walker passing by. Ordinary life moving forward without knowing that mine had already taken a different direction. I thought about Daniel then, about the boy he used to be, the way he would run into the house after school and call out for me before he even set his backpack down. And I tried to connect that memory to the man who had sat across from me the night before, silent, detached, but the distance between those two versions of him felt too wide to cross, and I understood something I had been avoiding for a long time, that love does not always guarantee respect, and sacrifice does not always earn loyalty. I took another sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest, and I reached for my phone, not to call him, not to explain anything, but to scroll through the calendar I had been quietly building over the past few weeks, appointments, meetings, small steps that were now leading somewhere very real. There was a visit scheduled later that afternoon, one I had arranged carefully, without mentioning it to anyone. I closed the calendar and set the phone down, my reflection faintly visible in the dark screen, and I studied it for a moment, not searching for the woman they saw, but for the one I knew I had become. Someone who no longer needed permission to move forward. Someone who understood that silence could be more powerful than any argument. I stood, rinsed my cup, and placed it neatly in the sink. Every movement deliberate, unhurried, because there was no need to rush anymore. The pieces were already in place, and as I reached for my coat and keys, I felt that same quiet certainty from the night before settle deeper into me. Not sharp, not overwhelming, just steady, like a foundation that could not be shaken, and for the first time in a long time, I was not wondering how things would turn out. I already knew. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always did, and sat in my car across the street, watching the house in silence before stepping out. It stood there exactly as I remembered from the first time I had seen it, tall windows catching the morning light, clean lines, nothing excessive but nothing lacking either, the kind of place that did not need to prove its value because it was already understood. I checked my reflection briefly in the rearview mirror, not out of vanity, but habit, smoothing a strand of silver hair back into place, making sure everything about me appeared as composed as I felt, because today was not about appearances, it was about confirmation. I stepped out and walked up the short path, my shoes making a soft, steady sound against the stone, and when I reached the front door, I did not hesitate. I raised my hand and knocked once, firm and measured. The door opened almost immediately. The realtor greeted me with a warm, professional smile, but there was something else in her expression. Too, recognition, Not of who I had been, but of what I represented now. Someone who had already made a decision, not someone asking for permission. We walked through the entryway together, the air inside cool and still, carrying that faint scent of new wood and fresh paint. Sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors, clean and uninterrupted, and I moved through the space slowly, not because I needed to be convinced, but because I wanted to take in every detail. The kitchen opened wide. Countertops smooth and uncluttered, appliances modern but not excessive, everything placed with intention. I ran my fingers lightly along the edge of the island, feeling the solid surface beneath my hand, grounding myself in something real, something earned. The realtor spoke quietly beside me, mentioning square footage, neighborhood details, recent upgrades. But her voice faded in and out as I walked toward the windows that overlooked the backyard. It was not large, but it was enough, a space that felt private, contained, mine. I stood there for a moment, imagining the silence of early mornings, the way the light would shift across the floor, the absence of voices that measured my worth or questioned my place, and I realized that what I was looking at was not just a house. It was the physical shape of every quiet decision I had made when no one was paying attention. Every night I chose to plan instead of complain. Every time I held my tongue and let others underestimate me, because those moments had not been weakness, they had been preparation. I turned back toward the realtor and nodded once. No hesitation, no need for further discussion. The papers were already in motion, the outcome already decided. She smiled, understanding immediately, and as we stepped back toward the door, I felt that same calm certainty settle even deeper. Not excitement, not relief, just alignment, as if everything had finally caught up to where I had been heading all along. Outside, the air felt different, lighter somehow, and as I walked back to my car, I did not look back at the house, not because it did not matter, but because I already knew it was mine, and for the first time in years, I understood something with complete clarity. I was no longer building a life around other people's expectations. I was stepping fully into one they had never even considered possible. I did not call Daniel that day, and I did not expect him to call me, because silence had become our new way of communicating, not the comfortable kind we used to share when words were unnecessary, but a distance that neither of us seemed willing to cross anymore. Instead, I drove back home and spent the afternoon moving through my house with a different awareness, opening drawers, sorting through things I had not touched in years, deciding what would come with me and what would stay behind. Each item carried a memory, but not all memories deserved space in the life I was building. I folded clothes neatly, set aside old photo albums, paused briefly over pictures of Daniel as a child, his smile wide and unguarded, his hand always reaching for mine, and I felt the familiar ache in my chest, but it did not overwhelm me the way it once would have. It simply existed, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been and what no longer was. I placed the photos back in the box carefully, not out of rejection but out of understanding, because holding on to who he used to be would not change who he had chosen to become. The next morning, my phone finally rang, his name appearing on the screen, and I let it ring once, twice before answering. Not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to meet him from a place of calm, not reaction. His voice was casual, almost light, asking if I had gotten home safely, mentioning dinner as if nothing had happened, and I listened without interrupting, hearing the careful way he avoided any mention of what had been said, as if ignoring it would make it disappear, and when he finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that used to invite me to fill the space, to smooth things over, to reassure him, but this time I did not. I let the silence sit between us, steady and unbroken, until he cleared his throat and asked if everything was okay, and I answered simply that everything was exactly as it should be, my voice even, leaving no room for interpretation. He seemed uncertain then, as if he could sense something had shifted but could not name it. He mentioned stopping by later in the week, suggested bringing Ashley, his tone careful, testing, and I agreed without hesitation. Because this was not something I needed to avoid, it was something I had already prepared for. After the call ended, I set my phone down and stood by the window, watching as the afternoon light stretched across the floor, and I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not waiting for their approval, not hoping for their understanding. I was simply allowing events to unfold, knowing exactly where they would lead. The rest of the week moved quietly. Appointments confirmed, documents. Signed, keys prepared, each step bringing everything closer to the moment when what I had built in silence would finally be seen. And when Friday arrived, I did not feel nervous or uncertain. I felt ready. Not for confrontation, but for clarity. Because some truths do not need to be argued. They only need to be revealed at the right time. Friday arrived without ceremony, just a quiet shift in the air that felt heavier with intention. I woke early again, moving through my routine with the same steady pace I had carried all week. Nothing rushed, nothing uncertain. I dressed carefully, choosing something simple but deliberate, not to impress anyone, but because I understood that presence matters when words are few. By late afternoon, the house was clean, not out of habit this time, but because I was preparing for an ending, or perhaps a beginning. The line between the two had grown thin. At exactly 4 o'clock, I heard the familiar sound of Daniel's car pulling into the driveway, followed by the softer click of Ashley's door, and for a moment I stood still in the hallway, listening, not with anxiety, but with clarity. This was the moment everything I had built in silence would begin to surface. I opened the door before they could knock. Daniel smiled in that polite, slightly uncertain way he had developed, while Ashley stepped forward with the same composed confidence she always carried, her eyes scanning the room quickly, as if measuring, as if confirming that nothing had changed. They stepped inside, bringing with them the faint scent of outside air and something else, expectation. We moved into the living room, and for a few minutes, the conversation stayed on safe ground. Weather, traffic, small things that filled space without meaning anything. I listened, responding when necessary, but never offering more than I intended. Ashley eventually leaned back slightly, her tone casual but edged with curiosity as she asked how I had been managing on my own. The question sounded polite, but I could hear the assumption beneath it, the quiet belief that I was still exactly where they had left me. And I answered simply that I had been doing well, leaving the statement open, not elaborating, not explaining. Daniel shifted in his seat, glancing at me in a way that suggested he was trying to read something he could not quite see, and then he asked if I had made any plans for the future, his voice careful, as if the answer might require him to adjust his expectations. I looked at both of them then, really looked, noticing the subtle confidence in Ashley's posture, the hesitation in Daniel's expression, and I realized that this moment was not about proving anything. It was about allowing them to confront something they had already dismissed. I stood without rushing and walked toward the entryway, reaching for my keys, the small metallic sound drawing their attention. Ashley's eyes followed the movement immediately, sharp, alert, and Daniel frowned slightly, asking where I was going. I turned back to them with the same calm I had carried all week and said that I wanted to show them something, nothing more, nothing less. There was a brief pause, the kind that comes when people sense a shift but cannot yet define it. And then Ashley smiled, a little too quickly, as if she believed she already understood what was coming, as if she thought this was still part of the same story she had been telling herself, and I simply opened the door, stepping outside into the late afternoon light, knowing that in just a few minutes, that story would begin to unravel in a way neither of them was prepared for. They followed me without asking too many questions, though I could feel the shift behind me, the subtle tension in their footsteps, the quiet curiosity mixed with something else, something closer to doubt. Daniel locked the door out of habit and caught up beside me, asking again where we were going, his tone light but edged with uncertainty. And I simply told him it was not far, that I wanted them to see something important. Ashley walked slightly ahead now, her posture still confident, but her eyes sharper, scanning the street, the neighborhood, as if she were trying to place where this was leading. We reached my car, and I unlocked it, taking my place behind the wheel without hesitation. They settled in, the doors closing with a soft, final sound that seemed louder than usual, and as I started the engine, the silence inside the car stretched just long enough to be noticed. The drive itself was only about 15 minutes, but it felt longer, not because of distance, but because of what it carried. Daniel tried to fill the space with small talk at first, mentioning work, traffic, something about a new restaurant opening nearby, but his words faded quickly when I did not engage beyond a simple nod. Ashley remained quiet, her gaze fixed out the window, but I could see her reflection in the glass. The way her expression had tightened slightly, the way she was beginning to realize this was not what she expected. We turned off the main road into a quieter neighborhood, one with wider streets, newer homes, trees lining the sidewalks in a way that felt intentional, maintained, and I heard Daniel's voice shift as he asked where exactly we were going. His tone now more direct, less casual, and I told him we were almost there. Nothing more. When I slowed the car and turned into the driveway, neither of them spoke at first. The house stood in front of us, clean and steady, its windows catching the late afternoon light in a way that made everything look brighter, clearer, and I turned off the engine, the sudden silence settling over us like a held breath. Ashley was the first to react, a small pause, then a quiet question, asking whose house this was. Her voice controlled, but no longer certain. Daniel looked from the house to me, confusion written plainly across his face, and I reached for the keys in my lap, letting them catch the light for just a moment before I spoke, telling them this was what I wanted to show them, nothing more, nothing less. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, not checking if they were following, because I knew they would, and as I reached the door, I did not rush. I did not hesitate. I simply inserted the key and turned it, the soft click echoing louder than any words could have, and for the first time since that dinner, I allowed the silence to speak for me. The door opened smoothly, and I stepped inside without a word, the cool air greeting me like something familiar even though it was still new. I walked a few steps forward, and then stopped, not turning around immediately, giving them time to follow, to see it for themselves. I heard their footsteps hesitate at the threshold, then continue slowly, the sound softer now, more cautious, and when I finally turned, I saw it in their faces. Not shock in the loud sense, not disbelief spoken out loud, but something quieter, heavier, the kind that settles in before words can catch up. Ashley's eyes moved quickly across the space, taking in the high ceilings, the clean lines, the light that filled every corner without effort. Her confidence had shifted, not gone, but interrupted, and Daniel stood just behind her, his gaze fixed on me, as if trying to connect what he was seeing with everything he thought he knew. I walked toward the kitchen, running my hand lightly along the counter the same way I had done before, grounding myself in the reality of it, not to prove anything to them, but to remind myself that this was not a moment I had imagined. This was something I had built piece by piece. I heard Ashley ask quietly how long I had been looking for a place like this, her voice controlled, but no longer certain, and I answered simply that I had not been looking, I had been planning. The distinction hung in the air between us, subtle but undeniable. Daniel stepped further into the room, turning slowly as if trying to take in every detail at once, and I could see the shift in him now, the realization forming without being spoken, the understanding that the version of me he had accepted was incomplete, perhaps entirely wrong. We moved through the house together, each room opening into the next. Nothing excessive, nothing loud, just space, intention, quiet strength, the kind that does not need explanation. And with each step, the silence grew heavier, not uncomfortable, but revealing. Ashley stopped near the window overlooking the backyard, her reflection faint against the glass, and for a moment she did not speak at all. Daniel finally broke the silence, asking how I had managed this, his voice softer than I had heard in a long time, not accusatory, not defensive, just uncertain, and I turned to face him fully, meeting his eyes without hesitation, and told him that I had done it the same way I had done everything else in my life, slowly, carefully, without needing anyone's permission. The words were simple, but they carried something deeper, something that could not be undone. And I saw it then, the exact moment it settled in for both of them, not just what this house represented, but what it revealed about everything that had come before, the assumptions, the dismissals, the quiet decisions they had made about me without ever asking who I really was, and I did not need to say anything more, because the truth was already standing in front of them, solid and undeniable, filling the space between us with a clarity that no explanation could have achieved. I did not rush to fill the silence after that, because there was nothing left that needed to be explained. Daniel stood there for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly across the room again, as if seeing it differently now, not just as a house, but as something that carried weight, something that forced him to reconsider everything he had assumed. Ashley turned away from the window and faced me, her expression carefully composed, but I could see the shift beneath it, the calculation, the quiet effort to regain control of a situation that was no longer hers to define. She asked if I was planning to move in soon, her tone measured, polite, as if she could still place herself within this new reality, and I answered that I already had, that everything was in place, that this was no longer a plan but a fact. The words settled between us with a finality that did not need emphasis. Daniel exhaled softly, running a hand through his hair in a way I had not seen since he was younger, when he was trying to make sense of something he did not expect, and he asked why I had not told him, not accusing, not angry, just searching, and I looked at him with the same calm I had carried from the beginning, and I told him that there had been nothing to tell, that I had learned a long time ago that some things are better built quietly, without opinions, without interference, without being shaped by someone else's limitations. He nodded slowly, though I could see he was still trying to catch up, still trying to find his place in a story that no longer centered around him. Ashley remained silent then, her earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious, more distant. And I understood that this was not a moment that required confrontation. It was a moment that required distance, clarity, boundaries that did not need to be spoken out loud. I walked toward the front door, not as an invitation, but as a conclusion, and they followed, their steps quieter now, more measured. Outside, the late afternoon light had softened, casting long shadows across the driveway, and for a moment, we all stood there without speaking. The kind of silence that no longer felt uncertain, but complete. Daniel finally looked at me and said that he was proud of me, the words careful, as if he was not sure they were enough, and I nodded once, accepting them for what they were, but not needing them in the way I once might have. Ashley offered a small smile, polite, contained, and I returned it just as simply, without tension, without resentment, because none of that was necessary anymore. They got into their car, the doors closing with a quiet finality, and as the engine started, I stepped back slightly, giving them space to leave. Watching as they pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street, I stood there for a few seconds longer, then turned and walked back inside, closing the door behind me with a soft, steady click. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not empty, not waiting, just complete. I moved through the space slowly, my steps unhurried, my thoughts clear, and as I reached the center of the room, I paused, taking in the light, the stillness, the life I had built without needing anyone to believe in it, and I understood something fully, something I would not need to say out loud for it to be true. I had not needed to prove them wrong. I had only needed to become who they never thought I could be.